All right, once again, it's very nice to be here, to be speaking to you. As was mentioned, we're now traveling virtually from the Arab countries to Latin America, and the core market is obviously Brazil. And I'm going to explain to you today the three of the most important factors on how to monetize and how to publish a game on mobile in Latin America. I'm originally from Germany, but I've been working for a long time with Latin America. Let's just say I had hair when I started. And I've been involved in a lot of the PC market. So we've helped bring Steam to Latin America. We've helped bring Origin and some other platforms. And I've been working with Tencent's Level Up division, which is basically doing publishing and distribution. In general, why is Latin America an interesting market? It's a very large population, basically double the population of the US. You have about the internet population of Europe, and just 2 languages that cover everything, with an already relatively reasonable smartphone adoption rate that is continuing to grow. And for gaming specific, you have the highest year-over-year growth rates, so the CAGRs are basically about double of those of China currently. We've heard earlier why that is to a certain extent. In terms of revenues, it's about the same market size as the UK, with about, like I said, 250 million gamers. And the very interesting fact is that the user acquisition costs, or the CPI costs, are still extremely low. So the US is about 7 times higher than in Latin America on average. In terms of the games industry, another interesting fact, since this is very much revolving around mobile here, 40% already of all the revenue from Latin America comes from mobile. You can see that on Brazil and Mexico that's a little bit less, just because those markets were more established, but overall it's a very mobile heavy region. So the mobile gaming revenue of the region is actually higher than, as a comparison, those of the UK. And for the success factors, there's basically 3 main relevant items that you have to consider. The first one are the different device types that are in the market. The second one is the pricing and the income inequality. And the third one is the accessibility and the different payment and distribution channels. So for the devices, let's take a look as a comparison here on the iPhone XS. So the selling price in Brazil is, the launch price in Brazil was $2,000 roughly. In the US was about $1,000. So basically an average Brazilian has to work 8 full weeks to buy the device, which means obviously the penetration of iOS in general and most high-end new spec phones is relatively low. So as you can see here, why is that? It's basically due to 3 main factors. There are extremely high import taxes. For most physical goods and electronic goods, import taxes are 150% of the value. So if you have a €1,000 phone or $1,000 phone, that becomes 2.5K basically if it's produced outside of the region. You have extremely high service taxes, which means it adds to the inefficiency. And yeah, it's basically a huge income disparity, which means you have a lot of issues reaching a broader mass. We will see that also if you look here at the smartphone share. So on the left you have the global smartphone share. You can see Apple globally is around 12, maybe 15%. And you can see in Latin America it's at 3. Which means that those people that do have Apple devices are very interesting for you, because they're going to be the top notch basically VIPs, as we've just learned from the to take the Arab version of it. But nonetheless, if you want to reach mass, you have to go and publish on Android. In terms of the Android devices, it's also important to note that those are pretty old devices. So the Galaxy J2, I think, launched in November 2016, iPhone 7 September 16, Galaxy J5, I think, in 15. So we're talking about 3 to 5 year old devices that were, aside from the iPhone 7, maybe already not at the biggest spec when they were released. So you have 2 main limiting factors. One is the phone space, which is kind of slowly storage on the phone, the hard drive disk, which is kind of slowly fading away as it becomes cheaper. And then the main limiting factor, which is the basically RAM capacity of the phone. What happens then is basically you have interesting developments in terms of slightly different developments to the global trends, and you have companies such as Garena, for example, that build games for originally Southeast Asia, but basically for emerging markets with a lot of low-spec phones, which reaches huge numbers of downloads, and is currently with Free Fire the most, by far, most relevant and most successful title in Latin America and in Brazil. While, for example, Fortnite, which globally is much stronger, has almost no chance just because it's requiring a minimum of 3 GB of RAM. And if we go back to this one, you can see that basically, aside from those that are coming in now, none of the old devices have this available. What you can also see is for PUBG Mobile, we've been working with Tencent on that for quite a while, and we've had huge issues pushing out the original version, so the PUBG Mobile, while the PUBG Mobile Lite, which we basically started, these are download numbers from about a month and a half, while PUBG Mobile regular download numbers from basically over a year. So you can see it's a huge difference if you manage to get the file size low and if you manage to get the RAM down, especially so that people can actually use it on their devices. So device is the number one point. Again, mostly because people just don't have access to better devices, but there are a lot of players. The second part is pricing. These are some average numbers from Google Play, basically, where you can see adjusted or correlations between the GDP per capita and the median SKU price. And what's interesting to see, obviously, the original is the US, so it's 100-100. You can see that in Europe, there's obviously an adjustment, but where prices are a little bit higher, that's usually related to VAT and a couple of other items. And per capita GDP is slightly lower, but if you look specifically at Brazil or Mexico, you can see that the GDP per capita is significantly lower. So we're talking for Brazil about a fourth of the US, but pricing in this case on average is about half of the US. So if you go, if you do want to have a chance basically to bring your title to Brazil or to Latin America, you have to make sure you adjust pricing because these people simply cannot afford regular European or North American prices. In addition, what's working pretty much as anywhere, but what's working particularly well with millennials and overall is anything free to play. So you can see basically the rate, in this case it's for online videos, but basically you have an 85% to 30% ratio. So 85% of users watch free videos, and yeah, about 30% if you look at Brazil, and overall I think it's around 25% or so are willing to pay for that. And you would face similar issues for your game or your app overall. So if you bring something to the market, it makes sense to focus on free-to-play. All the rest is very difficult. One of the main reasons for that is the income inequality that I already mentioned before. So you can see Brazil is basically worst in any of the Gini coefficients in the world. It's about one level of Botswana, and Mexico is not far behind. So you have some areas of the, or some small number of the population that have incredible high wealth and high net earning, and the vast majority is very, very poor and has very limited access to wealth. And that also shows in the top grossing games, basically. So you can see, this is from, I believe, at some point in November, you can see in the top 25, there's basically two, that was one given day, basically, there are two non-free-to-play titles. One is Minecraft, which, you know, fair enough, if you build the new Minecraft, I think you can go anywhere. But the other one is Farming Simulator, which I think was up there for like 2 days and then fell back to somewhere in the top 100. So if you look at free-to-play versus pay-to-play, or free versus paid games, you can see the revenue difference. So talking about Farming Simulator again, they made about 300K with it, which is obviously still a nice revenue, but it's much more interesting if you look at Clash Royale or Garena Free Fire, talking about 50 millions in the region, basically in Brazil. The third one, so basically, to sum up the pricing part, free-to-play is basically what it takes to be successful. There are some very, very few pay-to-play examples, so I would recommend that, and I would definitely recommend to adjust pricing to make sure that you have local access, the people can purchase the game and can afford to purchase the game, and you'll significantly increase revenues versus just plain out going with US or EU pricing. The last one is the additional accessibility options, distribution options. So one issue that you can see, and basically goes without saying that this harms significant the revenue, is that only about 5% of the population, I think it's 6.5 to be precise, in Brazil, and again it's similar for most other countries, have access to international credit cards. And thus also have access to international PayPal accounts or any other international payment services, which means that if you do want them to pay, you need to make sure that you allow for payments in local credit cards, debit cards, or ideally in some form of cash. The biggest one, most known one, is boleto bancário. We've seen, on average, for the titles where we've implemented local voucher top-ups and local payments, about a 3x in revenue versus the previous Google Play revenue. In addition here, you can see this is the most used credit cards. Obviously, these are local cards, but you can basically see that's the breakdown of the revenue that we generate with the different payment methods through the channels. Yeah, so basically, payments are the third part, distribution would be the third part. Google Play has very, very strong numbers when it comes to downloads, but they have big issues when it comes to monetization, simply because they have a lot of other countries to care about that are much more relevant in revenue for them. And they're slowly changing this, which is great because it gives additional potential to everybody. But if you're really looking to monetize and to make sure that your game has a strong stance in the market, then you have to go with alternative distribution and monetization schemes. Yeah, last but not least, I wanted to show a little bit about what's to come. So if you look at the smartphone adoption I was mentioning, where Latin America is more or less on pair, a little bit behind, obviously, with much older phones, much lower spec phones. But it is increasing significantly and will continue to do so, and will probably peak kind of similarly as in the developed countries overall. So you have the same potential to grow up there. And yeah, you can see this is the current one. So if you're comparing it, it's already more or less there, with the exception maybe of Mexico that still has a little bit of work to do to catch up. But overall, it's quite similar. With the difference that you still have a lot of growth potential, and user acquisition costs are extremely lower, like I said, 7 times lower than in the US, for example, which is why we're seeing a lot of good return to the investment, and of course also there's a potential future return as the economy grows. Last but not least as well, you can see that the infrastructure is also getting better, which is very important. We had a first kind of wave of games coming to Brazil in 2012, 13 that were mobile MMOs from the Asian countries. And of course, if you're blessed with the internet that Korea has, that's great. If you're in Brazil, that's not so great, because you can basically play for half a second and then get disconnected and lose your round, or whatever happens. Yeah, so basically this is catching up a little bit more, still kind of away from it. And if you consider the cost that you have for Brazilian internet, for example, they're significantly higher based on per capita GDP than you'd have here, but it's kind of slowly catching up, and especially in the cities, it's basically almost on par with most of the European markets. So it's no longer necessary to just focus on desynchronized games, which was previously the case, but you can also go pretty much MMO if you want to. And that's basically it. I don't know if we have time for questions, I guess.
Yes, we do. Perfect. Have, yeah. Not for me, but okay, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, very interesting. Just a quick question regarding alternative distribution channels you mentioned. What do you mean by that?
So for example, we have integration for people to purchase top-ups and to download games through the carriers directly. We work with large e-tailers that have huge mobile user numbers, basically. They have their own apps where they distribute content as well. And we also work through other alternative methods. So we work with loyalty programs. We work basically with anyone who has relevant mobile traffic because they're interested to help with that as well. And it's kind of building a much less to the same extent as China, but it's slowly building a more of a defragmented setup where you have more players in the game that are basically trying to get into it as well. And they're very eager for content. And in general, the Brazilian population or the Latin population is very heavily inspired by the US for content. So anything that's global content will pretty much work as well.